Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. I hope everybody's doing well out there. Today we're going to get right into it. We're going to be talking about the millennial reign of Christ. Okay, now this is a very hotly debated topic, both in futurism and full preterism, and all the different views actually. Everybody's wondering, when is the millennial reign of Christ? When was it? Will it be in the future? Was it in the past? And just like anything else, there's so many different interpretations and perspectives on this particular topic, but it's actually pretty damn simple when you boil it down, okay? And I like to use the border patrol arguments, as those of you who have been around know. I like to kind of cut arguments off at the ankles and use logic and clear time indicating texts to show that this cannot extend beyond this point or couldn't have begun before this point. And usually when you do that, you can kind of narrow it down to when it was, and that's worked out really well. And it also simplifies things, because otherwise, if you don't have any time indicators and border patrol statements, you can kind of go off in this wild speculation and anything goes, right? And that's basically where we're at in Christianity today, with over 2,000 different denominations and utter confusion left and right. So the topic today is the 1,000-year reign. When did it end? Okay, now I'm not going to necessarily make a solid case, or I should say a concrete case for when it began. I'm going to suggest when I think it began, but I'm not going to, try to basically say with absolute certainty it began here. But I can say with absolute certainty that it ended at a certain place, okay? And that's easy to prove. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use 3 simple steps to piece this all together, okay? 1, 2, 3, bing, bang, boom, 3 strikes, you're out, and you should have your answer. All right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, does the New Testament say when Christ would reign, okay? Or when Christ was reigning, all right? Because that's the whole point, right? The millennial reign of Christ was Christ's reign, all right? So does the New Testament clearly give us an indicator or a statement or statements that say when Christ was reigning or when he would reign? Well, yes, it does. Okay, let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. We're going to read verses 20 to 28. Okay, here it is. But now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since by man came death, for since by man came death, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive, but each one in his own order. Christ the first fruits, afterward those who are Christ's at his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and all authority and power. Here it is. For he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be destroyed is death. Now, we'll stop there for a moment, okay? And we'll continue in a second, but a couple things to take notice of here, okay? We have the order of the resurrection. Christ the first fruit, so in other words, Christ was first, and afterward, those who were Christ would be raised when? At his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father. Now that's important because he's giving the kingdom rule, right, to God the Father. He's handing it back over to God the Father. So I'll pose this question now, and we'll think about it as we go forward. But would Christ necessarily be reigning after he hands the rule and reign over to the Father? I would say absolutely not, right? Because you can't have 2 reigning at once, right? So he hands the kingdom over to God the Father at his coming, which was the end, when all those who were Christ's were raised. It says he puts an end to all rule, authority, and power. And then it says in verse 25, for he must reign, present tense, until he has put all enemies under his feet. So again, Paul is in the last days. He's talking, he's writing a letter, and he's saying that Christ must reign until this is accomplished, until this is, death is defeated. In other words, until he comes for his saints to raise them and give them immortality, he must reign, because the last enemy that was going to be destroyed was death. And in Paul's day, as he's writing this, death had not been defeated yet. So he says he must reign until he has put all these enemies under his feet. The last one to be destroyed will be death. Okay, and he goes on, he says, for he has put all things under his feet. But when he says all things are put under him, it is evident that he who put all things under him is accepted, meaning God, right? Now, when all things are made subject to him, God, then the Son himself will also be subject to him, God, who put all things under him, that God may be all in all. Okay, so let's think about this. We have Christ first, then those who are Christ at his coming, then comes the end. His coming was the end. His coming was when all who belong to him would be raised up. Okay? But again, like I said, note verse 25, for he must reign, present tense, until he puts all enemies under his feet. He was reigning when Paul wrote this letter. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Okay, now let's go down a little further in this same chapter in 1 Corinthians 15, and let's look at verses 50 forward. Verse 50, now this I say, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does corruption inherit incorruption. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we, the living, shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? Okay, now, notice how clear this is. Some would still be alive when this final trumpet sounded. Paul says, we shall not all sleep. They would at that very moment be clothed with immortality. And Paul says that at that very moment, death would be defeated. That's crystal clear, right? So if Paul said that Christ must reign until death was defeated, and if Paul also said that death would be defeated at the final trumpet, which was the coming of the Lord for his saints, and if he also linked that to their lifetime, then what's the glaringly obvious conclusion here? Well, the conclusion is that Christ would reign up until his coming when death was defeated. Plain and simple. Makes perfect sense, because Paul also said that at this very moment, the kingdom would then be handed back to God, and Christ would be subject to God, the one who is all in all. So clearly Christ can only reign up until that point. He's not going to reign if he's becoming subject to God. Okay? Now let's pound this home a little further. Step number 2. Let's go to Acts chapter 2 and let's read verses 29 to 36. This is Peter, and he's given his sermon to the men of Israel, and he says in verse 29, Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the father David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with him an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he poured out this which you now see and hear. And then he quotes, For David did not ascend into the heavens, but he himself says, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know, assuredly, that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. Now, here we see in Acts 2 that Christ has ascended, right? This is the account of just after his ascension. And it says that he has taken his seat at the right hand of God. Well, what does that mean? What does sitting at the right hand of God mean? Well, it meant that he took a position of equal status, of power, of honor, and of rule. John Calvin said this of that phrase. He said, quote, Christ was given lordship over heaven and earth, and solemnly entered into possession of the government committed to him when he sat at the right hand of the Father. End quote. Folks, Jesus ascending and being seated at the right hand of the Father is the actual dictionary definition of reigning. Okay, this is another punch right to the throat of those who argue for a post-AD 70 millennial reign. Acts chapter 2 shows clearly that he was reigning right then and there. Notice Peter quotes David there from Psalm 110. And notice how his seating at the right hand of God, aka his reign, was until he made his enemies his footstool. Again, that ties beautifully back to what I just showed you in 1 Corinthians 15, that Christ would be seated at the right hand of God, ruling and reigning, and that would end at his coming, which is the point when they would inherit immortality, the enemies were defeated, and death was destroyed. Perfect unity, perfect symmetry, and just makes perfect sense. Seated at the right hand of God means reigning. Okay, he took his position of rule over that government. So far, what we've done simply here is we've pinpointed the end of the reign. Okay, we've shown that Paul clearly says he was reigning in those last days. Peter clearly says that he ascended and sat at the right hand of God, which was a position of rule and reign, a position of power. Okay? Paul says he must rule and reign until all enemies are defeated, the last one being death. Paul also said that at his coming for his saints, when they were changed to immortal in the lifetime of those first century believers, that's the point when death would be defeated. So therefore, it's very easy to conclude that the reign of Christ would take place up until his coming, when he came for his saints, changed them to immortal, and delivered the kingdom back to God, and then he himself was subjected to God. Let's look at step number 3, Revelation chapter 20. Now, there's a lot of clowns out there, for whatever reason, they love to go to easily the most symbolic place in the entire Bible, the book of Revelation, and they stick their flags in the ground and they argue that they have it all figured out, right? It's laughable, okay? But I don't need to try to pinpoint all of these insanely symbolic, magic mushroom on steroids type events, like an angel falling from the heavens with a key in its hand, or a dragon being bound for 1,000 years, or a dragon being released, souls who have been beheaded, a beast in his image, priests reigning for 1,000 years, Satan being loosed from his prison, Gog and Magog, fire coming down out of heaven and destroying people, the devil, the beast, a false prophet being cast into a lake of fire, and much more. All of that symbolism can be looked right over, because you'll never figure it out anyway. So why are we arguing? Why are we trying to stick our flagpole in the sand and say, this is what it means? You're not going to figure it out. Sure, there's people who are closer to figuring it out than others, but there is so much nuance there, it's not even funny. And it's a book of symbolism, folks. It's not to be taken strict wooden literal. Okay? So you can look over all of that, because all you have to do is look at the final picture in that chapter, Revelation 20, verses 11 to 15. After all that wacky stuff goes on, after all the wacky stuff takes place, we're at the final great white throne judgment. The last event, the last thing we see before they enter into their New Jerusalem is this. Verse 11, Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. It actually says standing before the throne there, but yeah, same thing. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. Now, if you know about the book of life, this is a Israelite concept, right? This was from their Old Testament. This was related to their deeds under the law, their works under the law, okay? But notice he goes on, he says, And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. So again, this is a law story. This is a condemnation and ministry of death, aka the law of Moses story. And that's why the dead were judged according to their works. They were judged by how well they upheld the law. Okay? It says the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades were delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged each one according to his works. Now remember, in the Gospels, Christ told them that some of you standing here, here, shall not taste death till you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, and I will judge each man according to his works, he said. So we have that judgment according to works that Christ predicted as taking place in the lifetime of some of those standing there before him when he said this, supposedly. So we can easily tie this portion here, and they were judged each one according to his works. That is the same judgment according to works that Christ said would take place in the generation that was standing before him. There's no two judgments according to works, folks. That's nonsense. It's a very tight-knit story. So we know that this picture, this great white throne judgment, took place within the lifetime of some of those first century saints. Had to. Because Christ said, some of you standing here will not taste death before I come to judge each man according to his works. Same thing. But look at verse 14 in Revelation 20. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. So notice that death and Hades are destroyed there. Okay? They're cast into the lake of fire. That's the destruction, the end of death and Hades. Well, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, in the moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, this mortal must put on immortality. So when it has put on incorruption and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? In other words, at the coming, which was the moment they would be changed in the twinkling of an eye before some of them died, in Paul's day, death and Hades would be defeated. That's what Paul's saying. Go back to Revelation 20. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So this picture here is the very end, right? This is when death and Hades are defeated. So all of that stuff that comes before that, right? That Satan bound 1,000 years, the saints reign with Christ 1,000 years, the satanic rebellion crushed. All of that stuff comes before that final coming and that final change to immortal. Because that's the final point. That's the grand culminating event when they received their immortal, angelic, never-die bodies. That's when death and Hades was defeated. That's when the resurrection took place and they were joined together with their dead brethren, with the Lord in the air, where they would forever be with him. Now again, this is highly symbolic stuff. This is not to be taken literal. This is not to be, observed and studied and stick your flagpole in and say, this is it. No, there's far more clear statements than that you can do that with, like I just did in points 1 and 2. But this is just adding, flame to the fire, if you will. Okay? This just shows that all of that stuff that people like to argue about, the 1,000-year reign and the saints reigning with Christ and the satanic rebellion crushed, all of that came before. Okay? Satan will be released and he'll go out to deceive the nations. And they went up around the camp and surrounded the beloved city, and fire came down out of heaven, and the beast and the false prophet will be tormented day and night forever and ever. All of that comes before, because the final picture of this story is the ones being turned to immortal, death and Hades being destroyed. Okay, that's it. That's the moment they receive their promise. Because when you are made immortal, when the resurrection occurs and you're given your immortal inheritance, that's the dictionary definition of death being defeated. Okay? So, again, very clear, no ifs, ands, buts about it. The reign of Christ was taking place in the last days. Now, you can say, well, when did it begin? I'm not making that argument today. I know where I stand on it. I stand on when he ascended, right? When he literally took that seat at the right hand of God. To me, that's when it began. That's when he poured out his Spirit upon all flesh. right? And all flesh meaning those in focus, obviously. Joel 2, we know all flesh was not all flesh. It was your sons, your daughters, your men, your women, Israelites, to whom the promise was made. That's when it began, in my opinion. Now, people don't like that because they say, well, it says 1,000 years and you're only making it from Christ's ascension to AD 70 at his coming. Well, yes, I am. Because, again, you're in a highly, highly symbolic book that talks about millions of people, right? And there was no chance that these, numbers were in the millions. But it talks about a lot of wackadoodle stuff, okay? And so that's my opinion. I know some people won't like that. They'll say, oh, it's got to be closer to 1,000 years, but that's nonsense. Okay, that's nonsense. To me, it was the ascension to the coming, which was about a 40-year period, which ironically, the rule and reign of David, the patriarch David, was 40 years. So we don't see, it's not like it's foreign to see a kingly figure ruling and reigning for a period of 40 years, right? He came from the lineage of David. David reigned for 40 years over the people of Israel. So I think there's some symmetry there. The 1,000 years throws people off, of course, and that's okay, right? If you want to make the argument that it started well before his ascension, that's fine. You can do that. I don't have any issue with that. But we know when it ended. It ended when he handed the kingdom back to God the Father. Okay? So that's it, folks. That's the name of the game. And it wouldn't make any sense for him to be reigning after his coming anyway. Think about that. Right? Why would you be ruling and reigning after your coming, after it's all said and done, after you've given immortality to those who were to receive it? You've completed the mission. You've come back, you've given immortality, you've raised them to their new promise. You've taken them up and away to their heavenly Jerusalem, their city in the sky not made with hands, right? Spiritual kingdom. You've given them that. They've received that. The job is done. Okay? So what would be the point of a millennial reign with all this crap going on, right? That Satan's going to be released and Gog and Magog and another battle. It's like, it makes no sense because all of that's behind you, right? The coming ends it. The coming gives them immortality. And the kingdom is then delivered to God. So everything's behind you at that point. So it makes no sense to have a millennial reign or a reign of Christ after his work was finished. So folks, I'll leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed it. The next one I'm going to share is a verse-by-verse commentary on Revelation 21 and 22 because I see a lot of conflict, a lot of debate and babble about that, and I think I should put my stamp on it and just let you know how I feel about it. So look alive and keep an eye out for that one. It might be the next one I share just to kind of tail off this one, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like. If not, take a hike, and we'll catch you on that next one. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.